D, when the World Economic Forum rates us 24th in overall quality, when in 2001 we were number 2, we're going to spend less than $53 billion. That's not only weak, it's pathetically weak.
Mr. Higgins, thank you so very, very much for bringing this issue in a very stark terms to our attention. Now, you caught my attention earlier when we were talking about this, but here on the floor, this is a $1.2 trillion program that could create 27 million jobs in the next 5 years. And those are economic analysis that's been done by the New American Foundation.
It has.
Now, and how do we pay for this again?
Well, you pay for it as you pay for transportation improvements at the local, state, and federal level. You issue debt to finance the life of the project.
The same way we build and own our homes.
Pretty much
we borrow the
same
money
way.
to build that personal infrastructure, our home.
That's right.
Now, the borrowing rate for the federal government on a 10-year note is a little over 1% or hovering around 1% now?
A little over 1% for a 5-year Treasury note. It's 1/2 of 1%.
That's virtually free money.
It's virtually free
Now,
money.
it does run up the debt, but we are using that money to create infrastructure, a necessary investment for the economy to grow and to protect ourselves.
That's right. And according to Transportation for America, there are 69,000 structurally deficient bridges in the United States. There are over 2,000 structurally deficient bridges in New York State. There are 99 structurally deficient bridges in my community of Western New York. Every second of every day, 7 cars drive on a bridge in this nation that's structurally deficient.
Well, we saw what collapse can do in the Minnesota-Wisconsin bridge.
Yep.
And the loss of life. We saw what inadequate infrastructure protecting New Jersey and New York can do with extraordinary loss of public investment as well as private investment and lives. Joining us for this discussion on jobs and creating jobs is part of what we like to call the East Coast-West Coast team. Congressman Paul Tonko, you and I are often here on the floor to talk about how we can grow the American economy in a bipartisan way. This infrastructure notion that Mr. Higgins has brought to us, I think, has considerable merit and fits, I think, very nicely with what President Obama has recommended in his American Jobs Act, which was an immediate $50 billion enhancement of the $60 billion that we would otherwise spend, bringing the total to over $100 billion in the coming year. Again, enormous infrastructure. Mr. Tonko, I know you're on this issue. We've spent time talking about it in the past. Why don't you get on it and share with us your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you. And Representative Garamendi, thank you for bringing us together for an hour of discussion on what is very important: growing jobs, strengthening our economy, and strengthening the fabric of our communities by addressing public safety via investment in infrastructure. A very sound investment, and it's always a pleasure to join you. It's an honor to serve in the New York delegation with Representative Higgins, Brian Higgins, who served with me, or I with him, perhaps better stated, in the New York State Assembly, where I sat on the Transportation Committee. And I was seated on that committee right in 1987 in the shadows of the collapse of a New York State Thruway bridge where 10 people perished. We recently commemorated the 25th anniversary of that event. Very tragic. And it was in the heart of my home county, a small county of 50,000 people, Montgomery County, New York. And the impact economically that that devastating occurrence brought to bear was incalculable. So when you talk about, I listened with interest with the exchange that you and Representative Higgins had about how do you pay for it. Well, one way you don't want to pay for it is through an impact on the economy of your local region. The commerce hit that was taken was severe. The loss of dollars to the community was, just incomprehensible. And, of course, the loss of lives, which surpasses anything in importance. And interestingly, many of the individuals who were on that victims list were not from the region. So we're all impacted by weak infrastructure, no matter in which state that might be, because you never know when you're traveling over a situation that is unsafe. So I think it is a wise investment to go forward and put to work tens of millions of skilled laborers who can make a difference in public safety in our communities, making certain that the soundness of investment and improvement, absolutely essential for our quality of life, for our public safety, for the strengthening of our commerce. And we know that infrastructure improvements, when you and I have talked in the past about the infrastructure bank bill, we've talked about ways of leveraging dollars to weaken the impact on the public sector, on the taxpayer. There are ways to do that in very strident terms that allow us to go forward with the commitment, with the investment that is required. But certainly, with the aged infrastructure in this country, and to the earlier point made by Representative Higgins, if we can build other nations, and thank goodness that we have helped people strengthen their situation for their own people. But my gosh, we should take advice, our own advice here, and understand that there's a strong bit of economic growth that occurs when you strengthen your infrastructure, from traditional roads and bridges to rail to communications, wiring our communities, and to the grid. The grid system has had several tests designed to run for a monopoly situation and now being used to wheel electrons from region to region, state to state, country to country. So there's a huge, vast involvement of infrastructure there that begs our investment. And I think for sound reasons, for public safety reasons, and for economic recovery purposes, it makes sense. And let's put the people to work, and let's build a stronger community.
It is all about jobs, and thank you very much, Mr. Tonko, and your personal experience in the New York legislature and in your own community brings this issue into focus here on the floor of this House. As we build this infrastructure, if we add one additional element to the creation of the infrastructure, something that, again, we've talked about here many times, and that is that we use our money, our taxpayer money, whether it's borrowed or directly payment, that we use that money to buy American-made equipment, so that the steel that goes into the bridges is American-made, the cement made in America or manufactured in America, that we use that American money on American-made equipment. In other words, make it in America. So we not only are doing the infrastructure and the jobs that come with it, but we also use that to revitalize our manufacturing sector. This is a very powerful way in which we can more rapidly expand the American economy. I just happen to have two bills that would do that. One for the clean energy industry. If we're going to use our taxpayer money to subsidize the clean energy industry, wonderful. We need to do that for all kinds of reasons. But buy American-made clean energy products, whether it's a solar system or a wind turbine. And similarly with regard to transportation, the trains, the buses, the steel, let's buy that in America, American manufacturing. I noticed a lovely lady joining us from the state of Ohio. It'd be Marcy Kaptur. You've talked about these issues many times. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Congressman Garamendi, I want to say I'm just so privileged to join such three dedicated members whose states have been wise enough to send them here to Washington. Obviously, Congressman Garamendi from Northern California, and Congressman Tonko from the state of New York, the great state of New York, and Congressman Brian Higgins, also of the state of New York, a little bit upstate.
I thought he was associated with Ohio as much as he is with New York. Isn't he on the border out there somewhere?
Well, you know, there's a St. Lawrence Seaway that kind of connects it all as it flows into the Atlantic Ocean. But I wanted to say, you know, many of us, all of us, have come through very difficult campaigns in this political year of 2012. But what is wonderful about serving with the three of you is you keep the focus on jobs in this country and the importance of making goods in America and where wealth is really created, how we do that as a country, and what it takes to build a great country. I look at the St. Lawrence Seaway, and I think about Dwight Eisenhower, a great general, led our forces in Europe, and came home and decided that America needed to create the St. Lawrence Seaway so that we would unlock the potential of the upper Great Lakes and the lower Great Lakes. And you say to yourself today, with some of the limited thinking that some exhibit, of course no one in this chamber would ever be accused of that, right? But could we do the St. Lawrence Seaway again? I've had the great privilege of traveling out west, and I think I've probably been in every state and almost every congressional district at one point in my career, and to look at the Hoover Dam, and as I admired the dam, and I thought to myself, America has it in her to land a man on the moon and to create NASA, but here at home, our public works, do we have the vision? Do we have a vision big enough today in the 21st century to match what those who came before us gave to us, that put this continent together? And as I travel, I see water systems in disrepair. In fact, in my hometown of Toledo, they're trying to find $45 million to put a roof on the water treatment plant, which really needs $500 million to fix. I go to the new parts of the 9th District in the city of Cleveland, and I look at the need for infrastructure repair. And in the same city, so many unemployed people who could be put to work fixing the heart and soul of Cleveland. Or Lorain, Ohio, the number of brownfields that are there where we're waiting to clear property so that we can clean it up, move the sewage treatment plant, move other assets that are there, and create a much greater port on Lake Erie. And I say, do we have it in us? I know I have it in me to want to do this, but I look back at what our heritage really is, the interstate highway system itself. Again, during the 1950s, if we think about what was done, there was a time when this country, if you moved from, well, you couldn't move from Ohio to California on roads that interconnected. People think that just happened, but it didn't. It took real vision to do that. And all the statistics show that when we invest in infrastructure, that is the most job-rich program that this country could ever promote. And to create efficiencies and intermodal connections. Congressman Tonko talked about fiber optics and about telecommunications and all of the new ways of connecting our country. I've had the privilege in my career of representing many rural areas that are short, not just on doctors, but on telecommunications capabilities. It isn't just in the heart of Ukraine where people can't communicate, it's in rural America as well. And so I just came down here, I heard you speaking, and I thought, I identify with your cause. Thank you for talking about jobs inside the Congress of the United States. Thank you, Congressman Garamendi, Congressman Higgins, Congressman Tonko. Now, you all come from what is regarded as the coasts, right? But I'm from a coast too, the North Coast along Lake Erie. And it's actually quite a long coast when you take a look at it and you unwind it and all of the various lakes. So we're coastal America too. And I identify with your cause, and believe me, the people that sent me here identify with the cause of jobs and economic growth and infrastructure investment in our country to push us far beyond where perhaps Roosevelt and Eisenhower and Kennedy dreamed. Thank you so very much for this special order tonight.
Well, how correct you are to look back to those heroes of the past that laid down the infrastructure. You can actually go back a little bit further. George Washington, in his first year as President of the United States, instructed Alexander Hamilton to develop an industrial policy One part of that industrial policy was the development of the infrastructure for America's commerce, and it was canals, and it was ports, and it was roads. Mr. Higgins, so how are we going to make this happen? You got $1.2 trillion you want to put out there.
Well, I think you made a very good point, particularly with your leadership on the Make It in America initiative. Keep in mind, when you invest in American infrastructure, you're buying labor from American businesses. You're buying supplies and material from American businesses. You're buying engineering and design services from American businesses. And we also forgot a very important element of our economy. It's the thousands of returning veterans who've been serving our country in Iraq and Afghanistan. The unemployment rate today for those returning veterans under the age of 24 is 19%. There was a program started by the Department of Defense. It's now a not-for-profit called Helmets to Hard Hats. And what it basically does, it identifies 60,000 American businesses and some of the trade unions. They collaborate to get together to identify veterans who have already had extraordinary training in discipline and leadership and teamwork, and it accelerates their apprenticeship program. So these individuals could be making $60,000, $70,000 a year if there was work to be had here. So it's an investment in America, it's an investment in American businesses, and it says to our returning veterans, in a real, sincere, and genuine way, thank you for your service.
You said earlier that the American Society of Engineers, I think that was the name,
Yep.
Said that we have a D rating for infrastructure and that we need over $2 trillion. I don't know anybody in my district where we may have a serious flood in the next 3 days that says the infrastructure is adequate. They're looking at those levees and they're watching the water rise and they're going, this isn't sufficient to protect us. So in a very real sense of just safety, infrastructure is needed. But also it's needed for employment. You correctly raised the issue of the veterans coming back. $2 trillion. There's no doubt about the need. America knows there's a need. As the four of us have discussed here, there is a need, even a crying need and a human safety need right now. Not tomorrow, not 10 years from now, but immediately. The question is, how do we go about making that happen? And here, 435 of us and 100 senators on the other side of this building have the ability to answer the need, the crying need of Americans to build our infrastructure, to give us the jobs, to provide the foundation for economic growth, and to protect us. We have that power. Let's continue our discussion. Mr. Tonko.
You know, Representative Kaptur made an interesting point that there was a sense of vision when they pursued the efforts with the St. Lawrence Seaway. There was a sense of vision in my district as a donor area and in Representative Higgins when Governor DeWitt Clinton perceived this Erie Canal as a way to transport goods and to open up the westward movement, to spark an industrial revolution. That gave birth not only to a port called New York City, but a birth to a necklace of communities called mill towns that became the epicenters of invention and innovation. So it's that spark of vision that is the first step. And if we're going to denounce any of these creative opportunities to invest in nation building by denouncing it as socialism, you know, was President Eisenhower a socialist? Were all those who preceded him or followed him that came up with these great visions, a space program that gave us an unleashing of technology? No, they were thinkers. They were visionaries. They were leaders. And that's the first step. And then we develop policy from that vision. We tether it into real terms. And then we invest in the implementation of that policy. That's America at her finest. And you know, if we look back at the Erie Canal history, when they did that, it wasn't easy times. They were tough times. They were tough economic times. And so they stepped up to the plate and said, we're going to do this. It's not easy to launch, but we're going to do it because It's the way through the tough times. We have tough times now. Chronically high unemployment that for many preceded the recession. They need opportunity. Our economy grows when we invest in those workers of whom Representative Higgins spoke, in those materials and goods that allow for our nation's businesses to prosper, add jobs, become part of a recovery. So that is all very critical. You know, I talked earlier about the bridge collapse that spans the Schoharie Creek in upstate New York that you can walk across in the summertime. It was flowing equal to the efforts, the CFS, of Niagara Falls. So there are some economic impacts coming from Mother Nature that are driven by global warming, climate change. So when we do some of these visionary things, incorporate all of the policy so that environmental concerns as policy formats, with economic recovery terms, with energy terms, with transportation, can all be woven together, and you solve some of our ills where we're being impacted by Mother Nature with natural disasters that are draining our infrastructure, as we witnessed with Sandy, all along the East Coast, where now billions, tens of billions of dollars of recovery are required. Let's add the policy dimensions that allow us to reduce the threats from Mother Nature, build our economy by adding jobs and providing for public safety, and creating a state-of-the-art economy driven by transportation, communications, energy transformation with renewables and the like that will cut down on the emission of particles and dangerous substances that are toxic to the ozone layer. That's America at her finest. And if we do that simple thing of providing vision, followed with policy, followed with resource advocacy, we will have achieved, and our brightest, best days lie ahead, not denouncing that thinking as socialist.
There's a critical moment now, right now. That moment is seen in the deliberations that are going on here in this hall, in the Capitol, about the fiscal cliff, about the deficit. And there are those who would suggest that the only way to deal with it is with an austerity program. Reduce government expenditures at every level. There's some evidence cited by Mr. Higgins earlier that there's another way of dealing with this, and that is to put people to work, to use the power of government to put people to work, even if that means borrowing money at 1%, putting it into an infrastructure bank to finance projects that have a cash flow, such as your sanitation facility in Toledo, Ohio, or a toll road, or the St. Lawrence Seaway, all of which have a cash flow. You could maybe charge 1.5%. You borrow at 1%, you charge 1.5%, and we build. We put people to work. Ms. Kaptur, why don't you pick this up, and then Mr. Higgins, and we'll carry on our conversation.
Well, I thank you, Congressman Garamendi, and I am really listening carefully what Congressman Tonko and Congressman Higgins have been saying this evening, and thinking about what's going on in Ohio, the northern band of Ohio from Toledo through Cleveland, and the importance of manufacturing, and thinking about how hard our businesses and our workers have to compete in a very unlevel global playing field. And I've seen this directly in the automotive industry, where to this day, one of the reasons that our automotive industry had difficulty and why it required the nation to not let it fail and to pay back what was borrowed was because we are in competition with state-managed economies. In Asia, for example, we have countries that actually, one of them, I'm a member of the China Commission, and several economists testified before our committee a few years ago that what you really have in operation is market Leninism. I said, describe to me what you're seeing, because I have companies in my district that have had business deals in China that have lost millions of dollars. They've paid for goods that have never been received. Now, in a transparent legal system like our own, that could never happen. You have a court system. You have a way of getting your money back. But when you're dealing with a state-managed economy under a market-Leninist approach, you have powerful political people pulling the strings. It isn't truly a free market. And so whether you have a closed market in Japan, it's still largely closed to automotive products, or you have a state-managed economy, as in China, then you ask our automotive producers to compete, or any company to compete in that kind of environment, you end up harming our domestic production. And one of the reasons we are so elated that our automotive industry is recovering, and you see it all over our region, the power of industry to lift people into the middle class and beyond. You can see it everywhere, in suppliers, in restaurants, in theaters, in places where people are going now, even grocery stores, frankly, where people are able to buy more because of the recovery of this powerful, powerful industry. And I just want to end with one image, which is really hard to capture in words, but one of our companies in Cleveland has the only 50,000-ton press in the United States of America, Alcoa. It is 7 stories in magnitude. It is hard for the I feel very privileged as a representative to have been invited into the company to see this literally mammoth, magnificent machine be able to take parts and form them for industry as well as our defense systems. And it's 7 stories high. 3 layers on 3 stories at the bottom, just dealing with the hydraulics, the engineering and the brain power it takes to manufacture high-end goods is incredible. And we are so proud of that company and other companies that are able to make it in America despite all of the unfair global playing fields on which they are asked to play. And we see the componentry going into the automotive industry, into our defense systems. And we thank the corporate leadership and the workers, those who work very, very hard jobs that help us build the strongest country in the world. So I just had to say that tonight because you get as excited as I do about actually making things and seeing this genius that takes ideas and engineers them into products that affect all of us and allow America to be the strongest republic in the world. So I wanted to place that on record, and thank you for giving me the time to do it.
As you were talking so enthusiastically, I was thinking of some of Carl Sandburg's incredible poetry on the power of America and all that was done there. Mr. Higgins, you brought this to how we can finance our infrastructure, how we can make it in America, create jobs. Would you carry on with that discussion?
Yeah.
Or take it anywhere you'd like to.
Well, I would just say, back to the power of America. You know, you hear in this chamber a lot of tough talk about China. You know, the best way to respond to China is to stand up to them, to compete with them. And, you know, they cheat on their currency. They treat their workers poorly. They destroy their environment. But whining about China is not going to resolve this problem. Investing in America and the American people will. You also mentioned the issue of austerity. I think it's important to bring up. Historically in this nation, the economy went into recession. We had the Great Depression in the early 30s. The economy was starting to show, the American economy was starting to show signs of anemic growth right after the Great Depression, 1936, late 36. Congress and the President pulled back with austerity measures. The economy went into recession again. In Japan in the 1990s, they were experiencing financial problems. They imposed comprehensive austerity measures. That economy remains in a recessionary mode and has been for the last decade. You see what's going on in Europe today. Austerity doesn't work. Again, I go back to our recent history. The year 2000, budgetary surplus in this nation of $258 billion made possible by having created 22 million private sector jobs by investing in infrastructure, scientific research, and education. The best tax policy is not right or left. It's bringing lost taxpayers back to productivity. And that's the best, quickest way to do it, and you're helping American businesses in the process.
Mr. Tonko?
Yeah, Representative Garamendi, again, thank you for bringing us together. You know, you talked about that austerity budget that some would advance. I have to tell you, another disaster last year, Irene and Lee, that hit as a hurricane and tropical storm, impacted the several counties I represent, from Schoharie in upstate New York to Montgomery, Schenectady, Rensselaer, Albany. These counties were severely impacted. And to talk to the people directly devastated, I mean devastated, lost their homes, everything for which they ever worked, and to tell them we're going to change the rules in the middle of the game on disaster aid. It took fights galore to win that argument on this floor. And that austerity approach didn't cut it with folks who might have believed it before the disaster, but certainly not in the midst of. So we need to be there for situations, not only disastrous situations, but the investment that occurs so that we can effectively compete. We know in our heart, we know in our minds that there are ways to do this. I know, just listening to the magnanimous description of the situation in the auto industry that Representative Kaptur defined for us, on a much smaller scale, but equally significant, I watched some of the businesses in my district retrofit and do that through research and incubator programs and providing for advanced manufacturing, which allows them to have that competitive muscle that enables them to compete in that global marketplace. That made a total difference. Folks like Kintz Plastics in Schoharie County, New York, where they were engaged in an incubator program with Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Some very smart science and tech minds came up with ways to automate what they were doing, then train through the community college their workers to pick up on this new phase of activity within their assembly line process. Today they are successful, but it took investment. Investment of capital infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and human infrastructure. Training the worker and providing for those relationships to prosper. Everyone wins in that situation. So we know we have it within us to make this all possible. It talks to investment. It speaks to investment. It speaks to the opportunity that we can provide so that people can have that American dream tethered in reality, so that it can be within their grasp, so that they can continue to build upon this nation's significance. A great nation stays great if it continues to stretch itself. It's about the churning and the turning and becoming more mighty through investment of research, development, retrofitting our manufacturing base. We can win this by doing it smarter. We don't necessarily have to do it cheaper. Do it smarter, and you win those contracts that then equate to jobs. Research equals jobs. I see it all the time, and it gives birth to new ideas, new product lines, better efficiencies. It drives an economy. You can't walk away from this tough moment and talk about austere responses. You need creative responses, not just throwing money at a situation, but thinking it through. Thoughtful, analytical, academic approaches that then provide for the best policy formats. The President has offered several ideas that were not taken up in this House. And we could grow that economic recovery, which has been slow and steady, with 32 consecutive months of private sector job growth. We can expand upon that, and we can create much stronger numbers if we do it wisely. And so I think the American people have spoken. They've spoken to an investment in the middle class, the investment in the American dream, the investment in ideas and research. And we know, we've all talked about it on this floor, where research occurs, that's where manufacturing will network. It will migrate toward that research element. And so we are wise to invest in research and to invest in the human infrastructure, the worker. The important, significant part of the equation, having that trained, skilled, educated workforce that can make it all happen.
Earlier today, I was asked by a reporter from San Francisco about the effect of sequestration and the austerity budget proposals on research in that area. The San Francisco Bay Area is one of the great research centers in the world, with the University of California, the laboratory at Berkeley, and Lawrence Livermore and Stanford and others institutions in the area. the austerity program that is being proposed will devastate the research. Years ago, actually in the mid-'80s, when I was in the California legislature, we were talking about how to keep the California economy going, and I developed a plan, a program, and there were 5 pieces to it. We've talked about all of those 5 today. The first was the best, well, let me start different. Every one of those 5 were critical investments that the economy, the society would make. The first was the best education system in the world. Now, America has an enormous challenge here, and we're not measuring up as we should. And that should be a discussion we should have here on the floor, perhaps at another day. The second was the best research. The austerity budget that's out there, the sequestration and other proposals that have been put forward, slash the research budgets of the United States in health care, in energy, in transportation, in manufacturing, in those areas that, and in those areas that create opportunity. The third is manufacturing, making things that come from that research, and enhancing the current manufacturing technologies using, as you suggested a moment ago, Mr. Tonko, the advanced manufacturing technologies which come from research and the engineering that goes with it that Ms. Kaptur discussed a few moments ago. The fourth was infrastructure. You have to have the foundation for economic growth. Mr. Higgins brought our attention the potential for 26, 27 million jobs within the next 5 years by really going full on into building the American infrastructure, repairing what we have and building for the next generations. The fifth was change. You have to accept change. And that means that we have to learn from past experiences here in Congress. Mr. Higgins very correctly pointed out the economic history. When a recession was about to recede because of government policies, but austerity was implanted and a new recession commenced. We ought to take cognizance of that. So we have to change and grow and learn. Those are the 5 things. I often talk about them. Let's carry on this discussion. We have about another 10 minutes, and maybe if each one of us takes 2.5 or so, we can wrap up in time. I think I started with Mr. Higgins, and then Ms. Kaptur, Mr. Tonko, and then I will say good night to all. Mr. Higgins.
Again, I want to thank you for your leadership on these issues and bringing us together tonight to discuss this important issue. Hopefully it will be the first of many, or a continuation of this discussion. But, you know, even groups like the United States Chamber of Commerce, they put out a report stating that we will lose $336 billion over the next 5 years because of bottlenecks, because of inefficiency in our infrastructure. You can't identify the problem without supporting a solution. My point is that Democrats and Republicans in this nation should come together to support a robust nation-building program right here in America. It benefits American small businesses, it benefits returning veterans, and it has a measurable influence in improving this economy. The New America Foundation, as I mentioned previously, has a report, The Way Forward. It's not a right or left group. It's a centrist group that is very prestigious and basically says a $1.2 trillion investment in infrastructure, roads and bridges, sewer systems, water systems, the electricity grid will create 27 million jobs in a 5-year period. 5.2 million in the first year alone. That's 433,000 jobs every month for the first year. Can you imagine what the stock market would do if the jobs report came out next month and said that we created 433,000 jobs? Our economy is consumer confidence. We're all economic actors. When we're confident, we move. When we're not, we don't. So I just think it's very clear that what's worked in the past is what will work in creating the kind of economy that everybody in this nation wants very desperately. So with that, thank you very much, sir.
Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you. I wanted to tie together Congressman Higgins' ideas on helmets to hard hats, a program I've supported, and commend him for his leadership on that, and also Congressman Tonka in the efforts that he's made in the suggesting to us that we have to be visionary and we have to promote new research and development. One area we have not focused on during these discussions tonight as much as I would hope is on housing. Every recovery America has had since World War II has been led by housing, and housing has been in the dumpster for several years now. And one of the ways we do that is think about ways in which programs like Helmets to Hard Hats could identify sectors in communities that were depleted by the Wall Street crisis, and think about how to modernize the manner in which energy is provided to them, for example. So we're not just rebuilding to the past, but building the future. In my home community, we have something called an advanced energy utility that the Port Authority has established, where they can loan funds that are then paid back through the bond offerings they do. And right now it's in its early stages, but one could see where a neighborhood could be identified and new technologies in the building sector brought to bear to create the new neighborhoods of tomorrow. One company, Owens Corning, in our region has established a new manufacturing plant near Milan, Ohio, building a 7-layer roofing and the most incredible equipment. I defy any member of Congress to build what they have built there and to bring off these big rolls and be able to apply this roofing that I think is going to lead the industry. They could build 4 new factories depending on sales in the northern environments of the United States and Canada. And I see this and I think all we have to do is put the parts together and to build the residential neighborhoods of a 21st century America. So I'm just proud to join my colleagues tonight, and thank you, Congressman Garamendi, for bringing us together, as you so often do, to keep the focus here in the Congress on jobs and economic growth, which is what the American people sent us here to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, thank you, Representative Garamendi. It's great to join with our colleagues here this evening to share thoughts about how we move from a very trying, difficult time into perhaps America's glory days. I think it's important for us to first acknowledge that every member elected to serve in this wonderful chamber, the House of Representatives, and those down the road here at the United States Senate, each of us is challenged, required, and responsible to polish that American dream and make it within the grasp, provide it to be within the grasp of America's working families, and those who will grow into the middle class and those who are being further empowered by work, the dignity of work, and stronger outcomes with correct policy formats. I think that this journey that we've asked to embark upon by putting our names on the ballot begins with us, being a people of vision, being a House that provides a vision for America. That tells me we only need to look to our history, recent and some not so recent, but that will instruct us. Our history will instruct us. We have built a strong nation. We have provided for growth around the world. We know the secret to the success. We know how we built a nation. And it took a vision, a New Deal that provided for housing, for manufacturing, for a strong defense, for the opportunity for us as a nation to respect its labor force and insert a value-added connotation for that workforce. That was us in our glory days, and we're going to be even more gloried because of investments that we can make by sound thinking. The research that we need to provide will enable us to compete. We'll create products not yet on the radar screen. And if we think all the products ever needed by society have been conceived and designed and manufactured, then the story's over. But we know better than that. Product lines are coming up as we speak that allow us to use our resources much more wisely. We are a nation of abundance, but that means we can't be wasteful. We need to be resourceful. That challenge is out there to us. And as we become resourceful, we become more efficient and we become more profitable by sound policy. We can do it. We have ways to invest in our infrastructure, invest in research, invest in workforce development, invest in housing, invest in communities. And that investment will earn lucrative dividends. It's not spending It's investing with the expectation, rightful expectation, mind you, that we will get that just return. And so tonight I feel hope for our nation, driven by a sense of ideals carved by the richness of our history.
Mr. Tonko, thank you very much. Ms. Kaptur, Mr. Higgins, thank you very much. As I was listening to the three of you and thinking my own thoughts, I'm excited. I'm excited for the prospect of America. I can see the opportunities that are there. I can see the policies coming together, and each of the three of you described specific policies that we could put in place. I don't know if we can get 27 million jobs from an infrastructure, but I do know that we can get millions of jobs from an infrastructure program, and in so doing, lay the foundation for safety from floods, fires, from other catastrophes that could occur. I know that in doing so, we can rebuild our manufacturing sector by using American-made products in that infrastructure program. I know that we can provide the jobs that Americans desperately want today, not just cheap jobs, but real middle-class jobs, as all three of you have described. I'm excited. I'm excited about the prospect of building America, coming home from the wars and building America, as happened when my father came back from World War II. America went after building. Ms. Kaptur, you talked about the St. Lawrence Seaway. You talked about the interstate highway system that President Eisenhower talked about. We are on the cusp of a new building in America. We have the wherewithal. We can finance it with really cheap money now, and we can use these projects to repay that money. It's a very exciting time, and it's our responsibility as representatives of the 300+ million Americans to enunciate that vision, to put in place those programs, and when we do, we'll make it in America, and Americans will make it. Thank you so very, very much for joining us. I yield back our time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 5th, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, for 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some comments here in the last few weeks with which I'm privileged to be a member of this House. I thought I would read into the record a letter that I penned to my constituents upon the conclusion of my election process. I said at the time, I'm satisfied that enough votes have been counted to determine that I will not be representing the citizens of the 7th Congressional District during the 113th Congress. It was a tough campaign, and I accept the outcome. I congratulate Dr. Bera on his victory, and I wish him well as he accepts this new challenge. It is my hope that Dr. Bera approaches Congress, as have I, with a humble heart, respect for the institution, and a desire to perform his duties in the best interests of the people he represents and the country. No one can fulfill the obligations of public service alone. The contributions of my wife Bobby and our family have been inestimable. I could never thank them enough. My staff has worked tirelessly on behalf of others. There are no better public servants anywhere. I'm proud of the work that we've accomplished representing Californians both in the California Department of Justice and in the United States Congress. The experience of 18 years serving in the House of Representatives and 8 years as California's Attorney General truly has been an honor, and one for which I will be forever grateful. During my time in the House, we were able to build coalitions across the aisle to advance legislation that not only benefited the people of the district, but all Americans. I'm proud of the meaningful work we've achieved with Folsom Dam, our levees, U.S. port security, chemical facility security, cybersecurity, criminal justice reform, immigration reform, national security, human trafficking, reining in government spending, and the myriad of other issues that came before the Congress. Bobby and I wish to thank the multitude of volunteers and supporters who were by our side in this effort. Your support is gratifying and humbling, and for that we are immensely grateful. God bless you, and God bless this land of ours. I read that to suggest the feelings that I have at this time when I am approaching the end of my service in this House. And one of the thoughts that I have as I do that is the question of civility in this House, in the Congress, in the political dialogue, and in the country at large. If one examines the history of the House of Representatives, one understands immediately that we are governed not by Robert's Rules of Order, but by, in fact, Jefferson's Manual. The manual authored in the first instance by Thomas Jefferson. And if you analyze the spirit, and I believe the letter of that manual, you will find that President Jefferson believed that vigorous and robust debate was appropriate, but he also understood the nature of man. He understood that we sometimes did not maintain the type of discourse that would be of an honor to us and this House. And as a result, he envisioned a place for debate, a place for legislating, reflecting the views, aspirations, and hopes of the American people, that would guard against the temptation, the tendency perhaps to allow the emotions of the day to govern and cause conflict on this House, and indeed physical altercations or confrontations. And one of the manners in which he believed that we could guard against that was to have members of the House address the presiding officer rather than directly respond to another member. And some may think this is arcane, some may think this is outdated, some may think this is difficult to understand, and yet it serves a purpose. It reminds those of us, while we're on the floor, that we are here representing this country. We're elected from different districts, but we are here as members of the U.S. House of Representatives. We address one another through the chair as the distinguished gentleman or gentlelady from a particular state. We don't call people by their first name. Frankly, if we do call them by their last name, it is an adjective describing the particular person from the state that they represent. There are those who find it difficult to understand why it is wrong to traverse the well, why it is inappropriate for someone to walk here in the well, because this is a large chamber. It would seem natural that you would move from point A to point B. And yet the idea is that as I am addressing this House, I am addressing the presiding officer. And for someone to traverse the well is, in essence, an act of rudeness, an act of incivility, a lack of respect for those who are speaking and the institution. It is as if I were speaking to someone immediately in front of me and someone walks between the two of us while we're having the conversation. One would immediately understand that to be not in keeping with proper conduct. And yet I think sometimes we forget the purpose of the rules that we have here. Why do members come here, as I would say, because I was taught when I was a young attorney that you are to be court ready. If you're a male member of this House, to wear a coat and tie. You could vote easily without a coat and tie. You could vote easily in shorts here. You could vote easily in a T-shirt here. But what would that do? That would, in a very real sense, demean the institution of the House, and it would suggest that perhaps we weren't ready to do business. I recall several decades ago when a number of school districts believed that in an effort to increase the level of comportment in school, they would have students wear uniforms. It was unheard of at the time, but yet they found that when students wore uniforms, in some ways the gang colors didn't come into play. People weren't looking at who has the rich clothes versus who has the poor clothes. But more importantly, I remember a comment by someone who was in favor of it and said, this reminds the young people that they are there to do work to advance themselves for their future. In other words, it was their work clothes. That is a similar sort of thing that we do in this institution. Those are just some manifestations, physical manifestations of the kinds of things that lead to the idea of civility in this House. The other thing is that we follow the precedents of the House, rulings of the House, that guard against us bringing uncivil behavior to this House. that guard against us from violating the spirit of this House. What do I mean by that? One of the rules is you should not do anything that brings the House into disrepute. And one of the many precedents in the House is if you engage in a debate in which you question the motivation of your opponent, you question the motivation of a member of the Senate, you question the motivation of the President, that is considered out of order. And you can be called to account for that. And how do we do it in this place? Again, some would consider it an arcane way. Another member gets up and asks that the person who has spoken those words have his or her words taken down. And the process is, of course, the reporter transcribes the words. Those words are then uttered. They are considered by the presiding officer with the assistance of the parliamentarian. And if, in fact, they are offensive words, unless one is granted unanimous consent to have those words removed from the record, that person is not allowed to speak for the rest of the day. And some would say, what is that? That's like time out in a schoolyard. No, it really goes to the essence of this place. We are here as representatives of the people of the United States, from particular districts and particular states. But part of our purpose in representing them, our constituents, is being able to articulate on their behalf, being able to argue on their behalf, to be able to speak on this floor. And so therefore the penalty of not being able to speak on the floor goes not just to the member, but goes to those he or she represents. They are rendered silent for that day. If you really think about it, that is in fact a particularly pernicious punishment, because it goes to your ability to represent your constituents. It seems to me that those of us who've been privileged to serve in the House, less than 11,000 in the entire history of this body, have an obligation to understand that this is beyond each and every one of us. It is the institution, the continuing, perpetual institution of democracy in our country. And we should be very proud to be a part of that. Civility should be a part of that. Tough, vigorous, robust debate should be a part of it. But insulting, demeaning language, calling into question the motivation of another ought to have no place here. And while we are here, some would suggest in a cocoon, that is the chamber of the House, I would rather consider it to be a venerable place, a symbol of the institution with the words of our national motto above the very rostrum, that is, in God we trust. As we think about that, we also should understand we are part of more than just this institution. We are a part of the society in which we play, hopefully, a significant role. And the manner in which members get to have the opportunity to represent their constituents is through a process we call political. It is through an electoral process. And the electoral process reflects our society as well as giving guidance to our society. And there, I fear, the level of civility has been diminished. Let me give you an example. And I'm not suggesting in any way that this made the difference in my election, but it is my observation, having been a part of it, that the rules of civility have been tossed aside. There was an ad run against me and the gentleman from Florida and others, but made specific to each of us in our individual races, in which they had a girl approximately 5 years old looking into the camera asking this question: why does Dan Lundgren want me to die? As did a 19-year-old who indicated that he had suffered some paralysis from an accident, as did a 40-year-old woman, approximately, for some disease she had. Stunning. Stunning. The only thing I could see on the other side of the philosophical divide would be someone who was an Army vet, having been paralyzed, sitting in a wheelchair looking at the camera and saying about a member who had voted against a defense bill, why do you want me to die? Why do you want me to be in a wheelchair? In either case, the civility is out the window. The ability to talk about an issue that is underlying it is lost. In the example I gave, the question would be, was it an appropriate level of funding for defense? Were there certain problems with the defense bill? Not, do you want this veteran to die? In the case that I cited, in which I was the subject of that ad, the issue was embryonic stem cell research. Embryonic stem cell research. Not the question of what is the moral and ethical thing to do in a very difficult circumstance. I remember when the President of the United States, George W. Bush, had a national address to the country in which he talked about the difficult moral and ethical decision about whether you would have lines of stem cell research allowed that originated from embryos. The question of when life begins. Is that an individual? Is it a potential individual? Is it an individual that has any rights? None of that talked about in the ad. The question of umbilical cord blood stem cells, of which I have been privileged to be a leader with Chris Smith from New Jersey and others, having a press conference, I remember, with the great basketball star Dr. J, because, in fact, we had found that using blood cord stem cells had actually already been applied to some people with success, including, I believe, some in this nation who suffered from sickle cell anemia. Forgetting totally about adult stem cells, the ad appeared the very week that the Nobel Committee announced its prize for medicine to the two scientists who had unlocked the key in the ability to take adult stem cells and reprogram them back to induced pluripotent cells, meaning that they had the capacity to become different types of cells. And just 2 weeks before, I believe it was a German experiment in which they successfully cured paralysis in dogs using cells from the dog's nasal passages. There can be a legitimate debate about the moral and ethical concerns surrounding stem cells research and embryonic stem cell research. But to have an ad that reduces it to the question of whether a 5-year-old can look in the camera and say, why does this congressman want me to die? How does that elevate the debate? How does that in any way enhance our ability to make very difficult decisions? Does that condemn anybody who happens to have traditional values consistent with traditional teachings of the Catholic Church and other churches to be ridiculed, to be condemned for a lack of concern for fellow human beings, and to have the ad run in the last weeks of the campaign without any ability to respond to it? I ask you, is that civil? That ad was produced by the pro-majority PAC, by the way, with connections with some members of the House. They don't have to abide by the rules in terms of advertising, but my question is, where does that leave us as a nation? Where we can't talk about difficult, searing issues, issues of morals and issues of ethics and issues of conduct, without reducing it to that level. Look, I'm, as they say, a big boy. I've been involved in politics and government a long time. I know campaigns can be tough. But is that an excuse for losing any sense of proportionality, any sense of respect for one another, any sense of civility? We hear many in the press decry the level of debate, and yet not a peep about ads such as that. We hear people decry the lack of respect for one another, but yet not a mention made of ads like that, which I think eliminate civility. Some would say the rule of transversing the well while someone is speaking is unnecessary. It's, why would you complain about that? If you don't understand the basis of civil conduct in the House, you would say that makes no sense at all. If you do understand it, you will understand that it is part and parcel of the entire complex of things we do that either show respect or disrespect for the institution we serve and for our fellow members. I'm not a Pollyanna. I've seen campaigns since I was a very little kid. I think I was 4 or 6 years old when I handed out literature from one of my neighbors running for Congress for the first time. I've been blessed to be involved with this. It has been a great ride to be able to represent my fellow constituents here in the House of Representatives in 2 different tours of service and as the California Attorney General. I want tough and vigorous and robust debate. But I do wonder whether the coarseness of the debate, whether the lack of any respect for another's thoughts or another as a person makes us a better or a lesser nation. There is something called, in the phrase, appeal to the better angels of human nature. And maybe once in a while we ought to do that here. Maybe once in a while we ought to not only listen to a great speech by Abraham Lincoln or a great speech by Martin Luther King Jr. or a tremendous written statement by George Washington, but maybe we ought to listen to what they say and how they say it and the respect with which they held those who may have disagreed with them. This is a great institution representing the greatest country on the face of the earth. So I don't say this as a loser's lament. Maybe it's a lover's lament. I love this country. I love the state that I represent. I love the people of this country. It is, in a real sense, an unconditional love, but it is not an uncritical love. We have an obligation to review, to criticize, to constantly guard against the lesser angels of human nature. And you can do that with all the vigor in the world, and you can do that with all the respect in the world. And if, in fact, we wish to solve the problems of this nation, recognizing that there has to be some work across the aisle, perhaps the first way in which we do it is to think, how can I be civil in the discussion that I have, even though I think my opponent, my counterpart on the other side of the aisle, is dead wrong? I've always thought Ronald Reagan had the best attitude. I'd probably sum it up this way. You know, they'd say that he was always saw the glass that was half full rather than half empty. But I always thought he had what I called the openness of a confident and a cheerful conservative. He believed that we ought to conserve essential values of this country. We ought to avoid the fad of the day. And he believed that we ought to be proud in expressing our point of view. But I do believe he also thought that he could sit down with just about anybody and attempt to persuade them. Much like my friend and someone I considered almost a brother, Jack Kemp. I used to say about Jack, I'm sure there's somebody out there who doesn't like Jack Kemp, but I don't think Jack ever met someone he didn't like. And I don't think Jack Kemp and I don't think Ronald Reagan ever believed they met a man or woman that they couldn't persuade to their side. And maybe if we kept that in mind, how do we continue to work by putting all our effort into persuading not only our side, but persuading those who disagree with us to the rightness of our position? We might in fact find, and they may find, that we have far greater commonality of interest and approach than we ever thought. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you know me at all, you know that I don't give up easily. You know that I don't back down from a fair fight or any fight. And you know that I believe deeply in those principles and values that brought me to this place, and I believe deeply that I've not lost them. But I do respect those who have a different point of view, and I respect their sincerity, and I respect their genuineness, but I can question their judgment without calling into question their motivation. And maybe that's the summation of what I'm trying to say here. I have had the great privilege of serving in this House for almost 2 decades. I've had the great privilege of serving 8 years as California's Attorney General, so 26 years in public service as an elected official. I don't give up on this place. I don't give up on this country. I don't give up on its people. We've always had difficult times, and the key to solving those difficult times is to recognize their difficulty, recognize their presence, and recognize that we have no right to say it's not our job. When we are in this place, in this time, it is our job. And I would hope and I would pray that we would approach that, and my colleagues would approach that, and those that come after in this new Congress, that they would approach it with a sense of civility and a sense of love of this country. And if we do that, I have no fear for our future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with that I would yield back any time I might have.
Gentleman yields back his time.